Så. Då ska vi se. Då vill jag önska er välkomna till Elitprojektets Svenska Fotbollsförbundets serie av webbinarium som idag kommer handla om biobanding. Vi kommer presentera huvudtalaren här, David Johnston, lite senare. Jag ska börja med att presentera mig själv. Dan Fransson heter jag. Jobbar som forskningssamordnare på Svenska Fotbollsförbundet i det här elitprojektet. Där har vi som huvuduppgift att sammanföra den akademiska eller forskningsvärlden med fotbollsvärlden, kan man väl säga. Och detta webbinarium är en del i det. Och vi ska se lite på... Jag ska se om jag kan ta nästa bild här kanske. Så innehållet i kvällen då kommer vara att jag kommer gå igenom lite om, eftersom vi vill gärna att ni som tränare och ledare ute i Sverige får lite inblick i vad det här elitprojektet är. Så jag kommer visa er lite och på vår hemsida var ni kan hitta saker och ting i efterhand. Efter det kommer Tommy Lundberg som kommer presentera sig själv. Han är knuten till oss på Svenska Fotbollsförbundet. Han är forskare på KI och satt sig in i det här med future team, biobanding och relative age effect med mera. Kommer förklara på svenska lite mer vad det här ämnet handlar om. Och efter det kommer David Johnston komma in och hålla på en timme och presentera. Och sista halvtimmen kommer gå till frågor. Och är det så att man har en fråga så skriver man det i chatten här i Zoom. Så kommer jag försöka och ställa de frågorna till David. Och eftersom vi eventuellt blir ganska många så kan det vara så att jag selekterar något. Vi får se. Men som sagt, elitprojektet. Man kan dela skärmen här igen. Vi se. Hoppas ni kan se bilden här. Det är på hemsidan. Om ni klickar in på Svenska Fotbollsförbundets hemsida och går in under landslag. Sedan scrollar ni bort här alldeles längst bort till höger. Så hittar ni en flik där som heter Elitprojektet. Där kan ni klicka på. Här står det lite om organisationen. Och det som målet med Elitprojektet är att säkerställa framtida framgångar för herrlandslaget. Och det finansieras av pengar som man fick in under herrlandslagets framgångar i VM 2018. Och då har man tagit fram ett visst antal områden här nere. Fotbollsfysiologi, fotbollspsykologi, fotbollsanalys, future team. Wintercampen här, matchmiljö och elittränarfortbildning. Där jag som forskningssamordnare jobbar främst mot de här 4 första. Så det är de här som vi jobbar mot med forskning framförallt. Om man sen klickar vidare och vill fördjupa sig så går det att göra det. Där det står lite mer skrivet om de här olika områdena. Forskning och studier, klickar man på den så kommer ni kunna läsa om de olika forskningsprojekten som vi har startat. Pågående projekt och framtida projekt där vi bland annat har ett projekt inom just det här området tillsammans med David Johnston och Tommy Lundberg då, som vi planerar att genomföra under tidig höst 2021. Går man vidare till dokument så kommer de här webbinarierna kommer ligga här så man kan klicka på dem i efterhand och titta på dem i efterhand om man missar dem. Kommer också ligga såna här så kallade infographics. Som det här är ett exempel på, och det har vi startat nu tillsammans med en som heter Gordon. Vi väljer ut forskningsartiklar som vi tycker är viktiga för ledare att känna till, och så försöker vi sammanfatta dem och översätta dem på en bild så att ni som ledare kan gå in och klicka vidare. Just nu ligger det bara 3 artiklar, men vi har väl 10 i pipeline, och tanken är att det här ska bli lite som ett bibliotek med de här olika infographics. Så det ska bli lätt för er, och den här fotbollsforskningen som sker ska bli lättillgänglig, tänker vi. Det var väl det jag hade. Återigen, varmt välkomna. Som sagt, om det har kommit in några i efterhand nu, har vi frågor till David eller oss andra, så är det bara att skriva det i chatten till mig, så ska jag försöka framföra dem på bästa sätt. Då lämnar jag över till dig, Tommy. Jag ska sluta dela här.
Tack så mycket, Dan. Då ser du skärmen, Dan, va?
Yes, den syns väl.
Toppen. Ja, välkomna säger väl jag också då. Även om jag också är inbjuden, kan man säga. Tanken är att jag ska presentera lite grann på svenska här då. Om lite en grundläggande introduktion, kan man säga, om det här med biobanding. Och som Dan sa, så är jag lite involverad i elitprojektet, och framförallt den här delen då som rör spelarutveckling, talangutveckling och det som relaterar till fysisk mognad och mognadsstatus och fysisk utveckling och sådant. Annars jobbar jag på KI, Karolinska institutet, till vardags som forskare och lärare, och ni ser mina kontaktuppgifter här i marginalen. Så att jag ska inte bli långrandig. Det är David som är huvudgästen idag, men vi tänkte att det kan vara bra att liksom mjukstarta lite grann på svenska och dra några av de här grundläggande koncepten och lite grann komma in på det här pilotprojektet som Dan nämnde också. Fysisk mognad då när det gäller ungdomsfotboll är ju väldigt relevant. Vi vet ju nämligen att mognadsgraden varierar väldigt mycket under ungdomsåren, inte minst då under tonåren när den här tillväxten tar fart. Och när den tillväxten tar fart varierar ju väldigt mycket mellan individer. Och vi vet då att man har en fördel av att vara tidigt utvecklad eftersom man är då längre, tyngre, har mer muskelmassa än spelare som är sena då, eller det som brukar kallas för on time i utvecklingen. Och det medför då att man presterar också bättre i tester för till exempel snabbhet, styrka, hoppförmåga, och alla de faktorerna är ju relevanta för fotbollsspelare. Och sen vet vi också då från forskningsstudier att tidig mognad ökar möjligheten att bedömas eller identifieras som talang och därmed rekryteras till akademier eller tas ut till nationella läger, landslag, sådana saker. Och jag tänkte att vi skulle titta lite grann på en graf som tycker jag är ganska bra, som förklarar en hel del av vad det här handlar om. Ni ser här till höger. Det är då från 135 elitungdomsspelare i Portugal. Skulle säkert kunna vara Sverige också eller något annat europeiskt land, men det här är Portugal. Det ni ser på x-axeln då är kronologisk ålder, och på y-axeln då ser ni biologisk ålder, kan man säga, eller skelettålder. Det är mätt med en röntgenundersökning då. Och det betyder då det här förhållandet att de som ligger under den här linjen, de är ju så att säga sent utvecklade för sin ålder, och de som ligger markant ovanför linjen, de är då tidigt utvecklade. Och det man kan ta fasta på i den här grafen då, det är ju dels att vi har då spelare som är sent utvecklade. Här har vi då 12-13-åringar i kronologisk ålder som är 10-11 år enligt deras skelettålder då. Och i samma ålderskategori då, 12-13-åringar, så har vi då spelare som istället är 14-15-åringar. Så det är det första. Det andra som vi ska titta på i den här grafen, det är ju det faktumet att här då i 12-13-årsåldern, innan puberteten slår igenom med full kraft, så har ni ju många spelare under linjen här som är sent utvecklade och ändå är med på hög nivå då i de här åren, i de här lagen. Men om ni tittar då efter att puberteten har haft sin verkan här i 16-17-årsåldern här, så ser ni då att det finns inte spelare alls nästan under linjen. Det vill säga de har selekterats bort i den här processen, de som är sent utvecklade. Och den här grafen belyser lite grann dels då att vi har väldigt stor variation i mognad, och det är överlag en nackdel under de här ungdomsåren att vara sent fysiskt utvecklad. Ett besläktat begrepp som ni säkert har hört talas om, för det här har man ju pratat om sedan 80-talet faktiskt i forskningslitteratur i alla fall. Och det är den relativa ålderseffekten då. Och det är då skillnaden i kronologisk ålder mellan spelare i samma lag då, eller samma ålderskategori. Om vi tar ett pojkar 13-lag så kan ni ju ha någon som är född i december och någon som är född i januari. Då skiljer det nästan ett år då mellan de spelarna, trots att de är då kategoriserade inom samma lag. Och det här är ju en fördel, vet man, att vara född tidigt på året. Det är ju det som den här effekten är förknippad med, relativa ålderseffekten. Om man tittar på födelsekvartal i ungdomslandslag i Sverige eller nästan var som helst i världen, så ser vi då att de flesta är födda första halvåret, och det är vanligast att vara född första kvartalet, och helt klart minst vanligt att vara född sista kvartalet. Va? Så det här indikerar ju en väldigt skev selektion till diverse talangläger och landslag inte minst. Men det är ju viktigt att poängtera här att även om man anser då att en stor liksom bidragande orsak till den relativa ålderseffekten har med fysisk mognad att göra, så säger ju inte födelsemånaden någonting om mognadsstatusen egentligen. Du kan ju vara född i januari och ändå vara sent fysiskt utvecklad. Va? Men statistiskt så har du en fördel av att vara född tidigt på selektionsåret. Det blir ju så. Och då har man ju sett att spelare födda tidigt på året då kan uppfattas som större talanger på grund av att de ofta har hunnit längre i sin utveckling. Och då får de bättre träning, mer coaching och så vidare. Man vet också att de kan uppleva en större självkänsla och högre upplevd idrottslig kompetens, de som är födda tidigt. Och vi vet att förekomsten av dropout är högre hos spelare födda sent på året. Och det här kan märkas redan så tidigt som i 12-årsåldern. Va? För att inte tala om att det till och med finns data som indikerar att den här relativa ålderseffekten redan finns när man kommer in i fotbollssystemet i 6-8-årsåldern. Sen kan man ju fråga sig då, är det alltid en nackdel att mogna sent eller ligga lite efter i den fysiska utvecklingen? Vi vet att skillnaderna när det gäller den här relativa ålderseffekten till exempel, de jämnar ut sig när vi kommer mot U21 och seniornivå, någorlunda i alla fall. Och det kan ju vara så att tidigt utvecklade spelare har förlitat sig på det fysiska övertaget under de här ungdomsåren och sen då istället försummat lite grann andra färdigheter, inte riktigt ställs inför de utmaningarna som de borde för att utvecklas optimalt. Och sent utvecklade spelare som faktiskt har lyckats överleva det här systemet, de skulle kunna ha en fördel längre fram då, för de har tagit sig igenom den här jobbiga perioden. Nu kommer fysiken i kapp och då har de helt plötsligt bra möjligheter att nå hela vägen. Och det här kallas för underdog-hypotesen och det finns beskrivet i forskningslitteraturen, så det här är inget som jag hittar på, utan det finns dokumenterat att de få som överlever det här tuffa systemet, de kan faktiskt ha nytta av det senare. Så slutsatsen av det här tycker jag blir då att vi behöver ha bra strategier i spelarutbildningen för att optimera förutsättningarna för både tidigt och sent utvecklade spelare. Det har ju varit så mycket att man har pratat om de här sent födda spelarna eller sent utvecklade spelarna och vill så att säga förbättra verksamheten för dem. Men jag vill mena på att det finns ju saker man kan optimera både för de tidigt och de sent födda spelarna. Eller utvecklade spelarna ska jag säga. Och det är då vi kommer in på det här med biobanding som är en sådan sak som skulle kunna vara till nytta i spelarutbildningen i de här åren. Biobanding då är en strategi där man grupperar spelare baserat på mognadsstatus snarare än kronologisk ålder. Och det gör ju då att den här mognadsrelaterade variationen som vi såg i grafen tidigare, den minskar ju. Och det här kan då användas som ett alternativt match- eller träningsformat som kan då komplettera den mer traditionella indelningen i ålderskategorier. Och så här ser det ut då om man tittar på den traditionella indelningen vi har. Då har vi ju till exempel då pojkar 13, pojkar 14, pojkar 15. Och om man tittar då på mognadsgraden då i procent av den förväntade vuxna längden. Då ser ni då det här stora spannet som finns från liksom någon spelare som är dryga 80% och någon spelare som är en bra bit över 90 i samma lag. Och så ser det ut så här då i pojkar 14 och pojkar 15. Det man gör då om man delar in i så kallade bioband istället då. Det är helt enkelt att man då till exempel från alla de här, hela den här spelargruppen, pojkar 13, pojkar 14, pojkar 15, så kan man samla då alla de som har nått under 90% av fullvuxen längd. De spelar tillsammans eller tränar tillsammans. Alla som är mellan 90 och 95% är ett band som är tillsammans. Och alla som är över 95% är ett sista band. Va? Till exempel. Och då ser ni på staplarnas höjd då att variationen i fysik, i längd, kroppsvikt och så minskar ju radikalt. Den försvinner ju inte, men den minskar ju väldigt mycket. Va? Och det här har utvärderats i forskning lite grann. Men forskningen är i sin linda kan man väl säga. Men bland annat då så har man ju sett intressant nog att tidigt utvecklade spelare rapporterar att biobandformatet var mer fysiskt och tekniskt utmanande och krävde då att spelarna anpassade sig till en mer lagorienterad spelstil. Och sent mogna spelare beskrev matcherna som mindre fysiskt utmanande men uppskattade då möjligheten att visa ledaregenskaper på att de kunde påverka spelet i större utsträckning och få visa upp ett större utbud av fysiska, tekniska och taktiska kvaliteter. Så det här var ju någonting då som egentligen alla grupper av spelare upplevde som positivt och också som en ny utmaning. Ja, hur gör man då för att uppskatta mognadsstatus? Ja, man måste inte göra komplicerade röntgenundersökningar och så vidare. Utan det finns faktiskt en ganska enkel metod som är ganska så bra. Och det kallas för Kames-Roche-metoden då, och det man gör då som jag varit inne på det är att man uppskattar hur långt man har kommit av den förväntade slutlängden, alltså procent av fullvuxen längd. Det är det som är den nuvarande mognadsstatusen då. Och för att beräkna det här då så behöver man vara då spelarens födelsedata, de biologiska föräldrarnas längd och nuvarande längd och vikt på spelaren. Så kan man räkna ut det här då. Och då räknar man helt enkelt ut var någonstans på den här axeln som spelaren befinner sig just nu. Är det 85% av fullvuxen längd eller 90% och så vidare. Och då kan man ju också få reda på en hel del andra saker, till exempel som ungefär var någonstans i den här tillväxtkurvan ligger spelaren. Vi vet att tillväxtspurten börjar ta fart ordentligt här omkring 85% av fullvuxen längd. Vi vet att peaken, alltså peak height velocity, det som är då peaken på tillväxtspurten, det sker där någonstans 90-92% av fullvuxen längd och sen mattas det av då och minskar då. Och det kan också vara värdefullt då, det ska vi få höra David prata om såklart då, hur man kan använda den informationen. Så vi har planerat då att göra en pilotstudie som Dan var inne på inom ramen för elitprojektet här då, där vi har preliminärt då tänkt att vi ska jämföra kronologiska matcher med biobandsmatcher. Så att vi har helt enkelt 13, 14 och 15-åringar som möter varandra i helt vanliga kronologiska matcher. Och så samma spelargrupp får sedan då spela biobandsmatcher. Där vi då samlar de som är under 90% i ett band, 90-95 i ett band och plus 95% i ett tredje band då. Och frågor då som vi är intresserade av, det är ju flera såklart, men bland annat då, finns det en urvalsförskjutning mot tidigt utvecklade spelare i svensk ungdomsfotboll? Är bioband ett lämpligt verktyg för att utveckla eller förbättra utvecklingen av både tidigt och sent födda eller utvecklade spelare, ska jag säga? Hur ser spelarna på det här biobandformatet? Och tränarna, vad har de för uppfattningar om för- och nackdelar till exempel med det här formatet? Saker som att skiljer det sig vilka som är poängspelare mellan biobandsmatcher och kronologisk gruppering. Om man har scouter eller någon form av talangbedömning under matcherna, skiljer den sig åt när spelaren spelar i sin ålderskategori jämfört med i sitt bioband? Och vilken effekt får det här spelformatet på antal bollkontakter och andra fotbollsaktioner och även rörelsemönster, högintensiva löpningar, antal sprinter, sådana saker är också intressant att titta på. Så det vi ska försöka få reda på mer här, det är ju då just hur kan man tillämpa det här med biobandformatet, vad finns det för användningsområde, och det kan ju gälla saker som träning, matcher, kanske skador, skadeförebyggande aktiviteter och då bättre talangidentifiering och spelarutbildning överlag. Och det är ju till det då som vi har bjudit in vår eminenta gäst då, som Dan har presenterat lite grann, David Johnston då, som både dels kommer från akademin då, är doktorand och jobbar med det här som forskningsprojekt, men också då jobbar ute i en elitförening i England då, i Bournemouth. Så med det så tackar jag för den här lilla svenska introduktionen och over to you, David.
Thanks, Tommy. I'll just share my screen. This one. Can you guys see that?
Yes,
yeah,
we do.
Sure.
Nice. Interesting talk there from Tommy. I understood very minimal bits based upon what he was saying in terms of his diagrams, but I'm sure we'll overlap in some places and also teach you some new stuff as well. As Tommy probably mentioned to you guys, my name's David Johnston. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Bath. So one of my supervisors there is Dr. Sean Cumming, and we'll speak quite heavily about his work, and Tommy's already alluded to some of his work as well. And then also I'm Academy Sports Scientist S&C coach at AFC Bournemouth, working from the under 9s to under 16s, where we use the provision of biobanding quite extensively for our youth footballers' development, and in the aim of producing the most elite players. So at Bournemouth, we have a sort of slightly alternative philosophy to some other football clubs in the way we do things, and we'll discuss those a bit as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions about either my work in terms of my PhD, looking at training load injury and how maturation affects that, but also my work at AFC Bournemouth, and give you guys an insight into how we work there as well. One thing I would like to say is that I'm happy for you guys to post questions in the chat, and I believe Dan will ask those questions during the presentation if they're really important and paramount at that moment in time. If it's a question that can be saved till the end, we'll go through all of the rest at the end, but there might be some situations where you want me to clarify something or re-explain something, and I'm happy to do that. And I understand that I'll be speaking in English, and like I didn't understand Tommy's presentation, there might be parts that you don't understand in my presentation, so please do ask. So the sort of overview of my presentation, first we'll speak about maturation and how it affects youth footballers. We'll then discuss how this will then affect the sort of talent identification process. then go into talent development, how we use this from both a sports science and physical perspective, but also discuss biobanding and using that as a tool as well. And then finally finishing up with a little bit on injury, about how you can potentially use biobanding and understanding growth and maturation to reduce the number of injuries of players during going through their growth spurt as well. So the first bit, and I know Tommy showed this to you guys already, but this is a growth curve here. It shows that there's a rapid growth during childhood, and as you come, I'm just going to put this pointer on. Rapid growth during childhood, this decelerates during late childhood until the start of adolescence, and then we see this increase in growth for both girls, peaking at around 12 years old for girls, and then a sort of a later peak for boys at around 14 years old. The keys here for me is that not all children will be the same. This here is a squad of football players, and as you can see, there's a massive variation between players. So you've got players there going through growth spurt before 11 years old, and some players going through after 15 years old. So really understanding growth and subsequently maturation, what we'll speak about in the next slide, is really important to understand those individual differences between just a squad of players that could be growing and developing at different rates. So as part of understanding growth and maturation, a real key element is to understand the definitions of both maturity status and maturity timing, as these are slightly different things and will help you understand the rest of my presentation as well. So the first bit is maturation is defined as the tempo and timing towards an adult biological state. So going towards adulthood at the end, which would occur down here, and each player or individual or child will go through at different rates and different timings, and it's often not as straightforward as this growth curve that we see here in front of us. In terms of maturity status, this is breaking down this growth curve into three parts. You've got pre-peak height velocity or circa peak height velocity, and post-peak height velocity, like Tommy mentioned in his work. Also, in terms of maturity timing, we have on-time individuals, which are what we would classify as normal and fitting the general trend, but we also have early individuals and late individuals. And these children or adolescents will move through at a faster or slower rate compared to their peers. So in this example of early, the peak height velocity is occurring much before their on-time peers, and on-time is again occurring before their peers, which are late maturers. Another note, and I know that Tommy mentioned this briefly in terms of the relative age effect, but it is important to understand that the relative age effect and maturity work in different ways and are different in their perspective. So over here, you've got an example from an English football academy. And as you can see, the players born in the first part of the year are massively overrepresented in this sample, with over 50% of the players being in this Q1 period, which in England is September, October, November. This would obviously change depending on when the cutoff date is. So if you use a cutoff date of January round to December, the first 3 months again would be January, February, March, and that would affect where you see this relative age bias. In terms of the relative age effect, this occurs from childhood or birth. So obviously, as soon as you're born, after that cutoff date or 12 months after that cutoff date would affect where you come in terms of your birth quartile. And therefore, we see this effect occurring from the start of academy football, which is under 9s in the UK. We also see this effect in other disciplines such as sport, education, and things like music and academics, where there is a bias towards skills that require a greater chronological age. So if you're 11 or 12 months older than your peers, that would give you an age advantage over the other people within that group. researchers have hypothesized that there is a correlation between relative age and maturity timing. However, a recent study done by Sean Cumming and myself using 6 football academies around the country and in Germany has identified that, in fact, the correlation between relative age and maturity timing was not significant, with an R squared effect of 0.01. So essentially no effect there in terms of the association between relative age and maturity. And as we know, maturity, the timing occurs at a different point later in terms of 11s and 12s. And then also they're caused by different things. Relative age is caused by the cutoff date, whereas maturity biases is caused by selection bias towards adolescents that mature earlier, and that is a biological effect. In terms of early maturing individuals, we've got a picture here of 2 11-year-olds. Obviously, it's quite simple for you to identify which player in that photograph is an early maturer. The early maturers are physically larger from the age of 8 years old. They enter puberty earlier at about 10 or 11. So you can see this individual here wearing the white kit. He has already entered puberty, and you can tell this by their facial features, the broadening of the shoulders and the muscle mass and those sort of things. We also see a increase in height, weight, BMI, relative and absolute muscle mass, as well as a different psychological profile between early and late maturers. In comparison, when we look at 2 players here, which are under 15s, you can see which is the earlier maturer and which is the later maturer. Up for this aspect here, I'm going to focus on the later maturer there, who's wearing the red and white kit. These later maturers enter puberty later, around 13 or 14 years old. They see smaller gains in terms of height, weight, BMI, and muscle mass, and they can often have a more anxious and socially awkward psychological profile. This then can affect a variety of factors in terms of youth football, and we'll go on to speak about those in a second. But in terms of understanding growth maturation, first we need to understand also how to measure these. And I know that Tommy spoke briefly about the Camish-Roche method, which I'll come on to here in a second. But first, to understand growth, we need to understand that that is their change in height divided by their change in time. So this is standardized in terms of centimeters per year, and we'll go on to speak about how you can potentially apply that later on in the injury stuff. In terms of maturity, this can be measured in a variety of methods. So already alluded to in the earlier presentation was skeletal maturity, which is measured by hand wrist x-rays. This is often used as the sort of gold standard in the criterion value in literature. The best skeletal maturity measure is the Fels method, as this takes into account confidence intervals and more markers of skeletal maturity in their assessments. The limitations of these methods, though, are the cost and the potential exposure to radiation. So in the UK, this method cannot be used unless there is a medical rationale to do so, as there is an exposure to radiation. I'm not 100% sure what the rules are in Sweden, but that is a consideration if you're going to use that method. An alternative method, which is being popularized in the literature, but there are some associated limitations that we will speak about in a second, is the maturity offset method. This is probably the most widely used method, as it's a somatic maturity measure and doesn't require any additional measurements beyond height, weight, seated height, and the date and date of birth of the participants. There's various versions of this, including the Moore, Meerwald, and Franson methods, and this compares the rate of growth of the lower body to the upper body, and therefore can understand the timing of the growth spurt through those measures. This method has, however, been identified as limited. There's a few references down here if you want to seek those further, but essentially it can underpredict and overpredict for late and early maturers, and can also be less effective at ages before 12 years old and after 16 years old. So there should be caution when using this method. The other thing to note here with this method is that when applying this method, it is very simple and easy to use, but however, those errors can mean that it brings everyone into that central tendency by over and underestimating people. So it often classifies the majority of people as on time, when in fact in football we are looking for those early and late maturers and how to deal with those as a particular cause of interest. Next is the percentage of predicted adult height. So this method uses the Camish-Roche equations to predict adult height. It then represents an individual's height as a percentage of that predicted adult height. One of the limitations of this method is requiring the measurement of parents' heights, which can either be self-reported or measured by the researcher or the practitioner. So just a little bit more on this method. You can have two individuals of the same height. However, they could have a different maturity status, because the process towards adulthood can be different between those players. So by predicting their adult height and knowing how tall they're going to be as an adult, we can understand this player's journey towards adulthood. And this can then be represented as a percentage. So the greater the percentage, the more mature the individual. Whereas this player here is a lower predicted height, he is closer to his adult height, and therefore is more mature because he is closer to adulthood. So, oh, sorry, I've skipped the slide there. So in terms of how we can then use growth maturation, we're going to speak about talent identification, we're going to speak about talent development, and then move on to a little bit about injury and applying these methods. So when it comes to talent identification, I always put this quote in because coaches always think that knowledge taken from coaches is potentially of greater priority. And Alex Ferguson was obviously a great coach. He said in one of his recent books in 2015 that the biggest risk was in youth identification is that they erred in their assessment of a particular boy, which they could have used that slot in terms of being in the academy for a more talented individual, and that some individuals take a little longer to realize their real potential, and not everybody develops at the same rate. And for me, this really alludes to the fact that understanding that not everybody develops at the same rate is obvious to us, but sometimes not considered in terms of youth athletic development. And this is how we can therefore use growth and maturation to our advantage, particularly in talent identification and development. And that's what the Swedish FA are aiming to do with their Futures project. So what we find in youth academies is that there is a bias towards selecting early maturers. As we saw in the previous slide, they possess some physical advantages over their peers. And at the ages of around under 12s, both in the Southampton Academy here and the Manchester United Academy here, we see this dramatic increase in the amount of early maturers from 12 years old, and the proportion increases above those of the others. The other thing to note is at the same stage, the late maturers dramatically decrease to a very low percentage where they are very unlikely to be maintained within the academy. Obviously down here, we've got a similar graph with the early maturers increasing in proportion and both the on-time and late maturers decreasing to be underrepresented in this sample. And this is partly the aim of what we're speaking about today, is how can we understand where our talented late maturers would come in, because in terms of adulthood, the effects of maturity are not going to dictate who is the best as being an adult, whereas these early maturers might just be the best at those age groups, however, not have the most future potential. So in a sort of way to understand this, we've got three stages here. So the first is physical performance. So we've seen how early maturers have physical advantages in size and muscle mass, and this relates to physical performance differences. We'll then go on to speak about some in-game differences. and how the physical performance might then affect those in-game differences, and then subsequently, how does that affect the perceptions of coaches and scouts? So physical performance. As we spoke about here, we've got an early maturing 11-year-old and a potentially on time 11-year-old there. And an early maturer early maturation is associated with greater body size, as we spoke about, height and weight, better explosive performance, increased sprinting speed, better agility scores, and better endurance performance. And this was found across the under 13s to under 16s age groups. However, I would also highlight that from the age of under 11s, where we start to see the early maturers develop, so this 11-year-old here, we could see those physical biases from as early as under 11s. This can then relate to in-game differences. First in-game difference would be their physical performance on the pitch. And it's been shown that more mature players consistently outperform the less mature teammates when it comes to GPS metrics and such. So their physical performance in terms of running meters, explosive actions, and repeated high intensity actions is greater for the more mature players compared to the less mature players on the pitch at that time. This can then lead to greater performance differences here. So this is a study that I'm working on currently, which looks at the relative maturity of the individuals. So relative maturity in this case is their percentage of adult height, represented as a Z-score. So early maturers are on the right-hand side and later maturers on the left-hand side. And this was done for each game with each individual. And then on the y-axis over here for this top graph, we've got shots. So the greater number of shots being up here on the left. What we can see is that the earlier maturers are having significantly greater number of shots compared to on-time and late maturers on this graph. We can also see on the bottom graph here, the same is true for relative Z-score, so early maturers and late maturers, and we have a significantly greater number of shots from our goals from our early maturers as well. So this alludes to those potential physical differences that we are seeing affecting how affecting performance in terms of both technical metrics as well as not just the physical stuff. And this can potentially mean that when we're understanding maturity in terms of shots and goals, as well as other metrics that we identified, such as tackles, long passes, dribbles, and such like that, there is an advantage to the early maturers. And they have a potential advantage because they've got greater physical skills, which then allow them a greater opportunity to get in goal scoring positions or be able to be faster to get to the ball in order to tackle, be stronger, and therefore this is giving them an advantage in terms of their football playing capacity, but also the technical and tactical outcomes that we see in games. These factors in terms of greater key performance indicators in a game can obviously then affect us in terms of whether the coaches and scouts biases are then occurring. So what we have identified in terms of the research is that coaches and scouts are biased towards early maturers. This here is a study done by Zuba in 2016. This study looked at how various factors affected their selection in terms of national team selection, regional selection, or no selection. Factor one was a measure in terms of psychological skills. Factor two was skill. Factor 3 and 4 were physical skills, including maturation. I believe that was factor 3. In this top box here, you can see there is late maturing individuals. Sorry, I've just got my. So late maturing individuals. Sorry. Yes, late maturing individuals, but they had good psychological skills and good technical skills. However, Due to the effects of maturity, we are seeing no transition of these individuals into their national squads. So despite being psychologically and technically gifted compared to some of these other individuals, these players were not being selected into the national teams. Whereas, for example, down here, we've got players with a physical and early maturing and physical advantage, and we're seeing a greater chance of selection into the regional squads. And the same here with greater physical maturity, again, getting into those national teams as well. This was followed up by a study in Southampton, which looked at scores from players. So what they did was they scored each individual within the academy in terms of their rating on a match day. This was on a 1 to 5 scale. And what Megan Hill found, who's at the University of Bath, that under 14s and 15s, early maturers had a significantly greater match day. This again links back to what we are seeing with the greater physical performance, but also those in-game differences of being able to show their skills in terms of shots, goals, long passes, and tackles. And this is subsequently meaning that coaches and scouts are identifying these individuals as performing better, despite them being early maturers and potentially that being the advantage that they have over their peers. In terms of our own academy at AFC Bournemouth, this here is a graph about our selection bias. Rather than it being the chance of being selected throughout the years, this graph is identifying the match minutes played. As you can see, coaches are more likely to select an early maturer to play more match minutes compared to the late maturers or on-time maturers that do relatively less match minutes. This can then provide secondary benefits to early maturers, giving them more game time, more time to show their abilities, and that cycle again of being selected for the next game and continually getting an additional advantage over those late or on-time maturers. So in terms of talent development, just before we move on to biobanding, I'm going to speak briefly about how we can use maturity scores to understand those physical differences that we've spoken about and potentially allude to this understanding of who has current good performance and who has more potential. On this graph here, you can see this is a general trend in terms of their speed, their time, in terms of a acceleration drill. You can see a variety of plots here and an age increasing along the x-axis. These lines here represent the 50th centile, 70th, 75th centile, 90th centile, 25th, 10th centile. So the lower your score compared to these centiles, the better your performance. However, when we look at our early maturing individuals, majority of these individuals here identified by the dots are performing well and are below this 50th percentile. This means that they are identified as being physically gifted compared to their peers. However, when we account for their maturity and move them from their chronological age to their skeletal age, being their maturity, we can see that their scores are decreasing in terms of being a greater percentile as they are moving towards this right-hand side. The opposite is also true for late maturers. In this study, they only identified 3 late maturers for the same reasons that we discussed before, because of those selection biases. But as you can see, a late maturer could get a potentially relatively low score, which would put him above the 75 percentile. But when you adjust for his skeletal age, he is actually above the 50 percentile, or sorry, below the 50 percentile, meaning that he has got a subsequently good score. This could potentially allow you to identify physically gifted individuals and also identify with the early maturers, individuals that need additional help. So for example, these players here might look like they're above average, but in fact, if their scores are over here, this would identify to us at AFC Bournemouth that these individuals need extra physical support for them to provide those talent development aspects to get them to the physical level that we need. So now going on to speak about biobanding. I know Tommy represented to you a figure that was very similar to this. This is, again, another figure from one of my studies that is currently under review. This shows the current range in terms of percentage of adult height for each age group. So age groups are in yellow. So you've got under 12s, under 13s, under 14s. And this shows that the difference between the latest maturer and the earliest maturer is very large. So in this case, it's over 10%. In this case here, you're looking at about 12%. And then again, looking at sort of 9% in the under 14s group. When we look at the biobands, obviously, as you can see, because we're restricting the variation that they can be in, so we're cutting off at 80% at 85%, and then 85 to 90, and then 90 to 95%. This reduces the variation seen between the groups. And this graph here also gives us an indication of where the players go in terms of moving groups for our later analysis when we speak about biobanding. So as you can see here, the bottom group in the under 12s move across at 85%. That group there from the under 12s, this group here move across into 85 to 90%, and then even some under 12s move all the way up into that top category. Same is true when we're looking for under 13s. So your later developers move down, your middle or on-time players move into the middle, and your early maturers move up into that top band. And then finally, when looking at under 14s, again, we've got a three-way split of some players moving down into the 85 to 90% band, some players staying in the middle, and then some players going up into an even higher band than that. This can then subsequently affect how we use biobanding for our talent development processes to understand how the variation in maturity and narrow that down in terms of in a biobanding fixture. So the overall aim of biobanding is to reduce the variation in maturity, like we discussed on those previous graphs, but also then subsequently use this as a talent development opportunity to challenge our players differently. So this is an infographic here from one of our recent biobanding studies at AFC Bournemouth. The key thing to note here is that 0 is a coincidence of no change, and then you've got 1 over here, which would be an increase, and -1 being a decrease. And then our early maturers are represented in green, on-time maturers represented in orange, and then finally late maturers represented in red. So what we found in the biobanding tournament is that players felt like that they were less likely to be injured. This could potentially be due to reducing the variation between the most and least mature. So by taking out those early maturers, it means that the difference in size, as we saw, sorry, that was my doorbell ringing. This difference in size that we saw can reduce down in a biobanding philosophy. In terms of leadership and social qualities, we found that in a biobanding tournament, there is an increased number of, they all felt that they were more of a leader within that biobanding tournament. Again, in terms of being able to express themselves technically, they all felt that they could express themselves more technically in a biobanding format. This means that they could have more chances on the ball and more time to showcase their technical skills. By taking out that physical difference between the players, we have an opportunity for them to show their technical and tactical skills. Next, were you able to have more or less influence on the game compared to your age group? The early maturers and the on-time maturers thought that they could have more influence. The late maturers, there was no significant difference. The next part is the real key parts here, and I believe that Tommy briefly alluded to this in his presentation. So when we look at the physical challenge, part of the aim of biobanding here is to increase the physical challenge for our early maturers by moving them up to play in against older players in terms of their chronological age, but their maturity matched. So this makes a greater physical challenge for an early maturer and a reduced physical challenge for a late maturer. The effect of this is turning an age group system on its head. So this means that these players have gone from being at a physical advantage within their age group to now being at a physical disadvantage, to give them a new challenge in terms of their talent development. It then can subsequently affect the technical and tactical. As we know from the discussions of our selection bias stuff and also the in-game differences, later maturers have a harder physical time in age groups because they are less physically developed. However, when we move them into biobanding, that physical challenge is reduced. This gives these late maturers an opportunity to showcase themselves technically and tactically, and potentially as a tool for us within development or retention to maintain these players if they are good technically and tactically, because those might be good indicators of performance at the elite level when they're adults. These physical differences can also affect what we're seeing in terms of the technical challenge. So because early maturers are moving up to play against players of an older chronological age, and there's a greater physical challenge, this then increases their technical challenge. This is a real advantage for us from a talent development point of view, because early maturers can often rely on their physical skills within age group games. This means that if you're bigger, faster, and stronger than all the players on the pitch, you might be more likely to use those physical skills than use your technical skills. By using a biobanded format, that early maturer then moves into an older to play against players equally mature as themselves, and therefore they cannot run faster than everyone, and they might not be stronger than everyone, and they might have to learn some new skills to cope in that environment. Again, the opposite is true for our late maturers, with the technical challenge being less for those players. This then allows them an opportunity to showcase what they can do from those technical challenge points of view. Sorry, just before we move on, obviously this therefore alludes to that biobanding can have some really good technical, tactical, and psychological and social benefits for us as a development tool. It can also be used as a talent identification tool. If we have individuals which are either early or late maturers at AFC Bournemouth, we like to look at those individuals both in a chronological age group and also their biobanding group. This means that we can understand that if we have an early maturer who is good, say for example in the under-13s, when we move him to play in his biobanded group, where there is a greater physical challenge and greater technical challenge, how does that player then cope? If they're good in that biobanding group as well, this can mean that we would then retain that player and sign them potentially. Whereas if they then struggled in that biobanding situation, this might be an indication that they are physically good, but might not have the technical and tactical skills for our elite environment. Obviously, then the vice versa is true. If we have a late maturing individual looking on trial, for example, we will then match them in their age group and then also give them an opportunity in their bioband with the aim of recruiting late maturing individuals, which other clubs might be missing out on. So now we'll go briefly on to speak about injury. So growth can significantly affect injuries, and we've got two common injuries here which are associated with growth in the lower limbs, and this data is coming from the FA in youth football. As you can see, the timing of Osgood's injuries occurs very similar to the timing of the adolescent growth spurt. This is logical, as we're we understand that increased rate of growth might increase the vulnerability of the tissues during this stage. We also see, though, the severs injuries are occurring with a peak at around under 11 years. This is, again, is also associated with the growth pattern, but it's important to know that the growth in the ankle and foot would occur before that of the knee, as growth occurs from distal to proximal. Therefore, the peak prevalence of severs occurring at under 11s would then be logical, as that is the pattern that we see in terms of growth. There's also a really good study here by a group in Spain that used players from Atletico Bilbao, which looked at growth-related injuries can occur all the way across the different percentages of adult height. So as we discussed before, you've got pre-peak height velocity here before 88%, you've got peak height velocity between 88 to 96, and then post-peak height velocity over here, with growth-related injuries occurring throughout those stages. The important thing to note, though, is again, we see this process of injuries occurring from distal to proximal, with growth-related injuries of the ankle and foot being severs occurring first, then growth-related injuries of the knee occurring, and growth-related injuries of the hip and groin, and then finally a growth-related injury of the back occurring last. So again, seeing that distal to proximal rate of growth within youth footballers. So there's a variety of potential reasons as to why growth can have a significant effect on injuries. The first is that there is a potential decrease in bone mineral density, which is then associated with an increased incidence of fractures during this phase. So on this graph here, you've got males on the top graph and females on the bottom graph, with peak height velocity represented as 0. And then in the black line, this one that I'm tracing at the top here, you've got the number of fractures occurring in general population. And then the dotted line identifies the bone mineral density per size. As you can see, during adolescence, there is a decrease in bone mineral density for size, and then an increase post-adolescence. This is opposed directly by an increase in the number of fractures occurring during adolescence, and then a decrease post-adolescence. So again, highlighting that bone mineral density is a potential link there between why we see an increased number of injuries during adolescence. Furthermore, growth could increase the stress on our muscle and tendon junctions and bone tendon junctions, and then ligaments and growth cartilage, which could be a further potential effect of injury. Again, then we're seeing adolescent awkwardness, which is a loss in motor control, which occurs during peak height velocity. That could be another factor which is associated with injuries. Adolescent awkwardness is a sort of a delay or a regression in coordination and motor control associated with growth, and this could then subsequently put players at an increased risk of injury. So in terms of how we can use growth and maturation to identify at-risk players, on here we've got a graph which identifies growth rate going from 0 up to about 15 to 20, which is peak height velocity over this side. And then on the left-hand side, you've got the percentage probability of an injury on a given day. So these percentages seem relatively small in comparison, but when you think about the number of training and match days that an adolescent football player might go through, these percentages will become rather large when you multiply that by 100 training days, for example. As you can see, there's a significant linear relationship between growth rate and estimated injury likelihood, and the faster you grow, the more likely you are to get injured. Next, as we can see here, we've got percentage of adult height along the bottom, ranging from pre-peak height velocity, peak height velocity, and post-peak height velocity. Again, the y-axis shows estimated likelihood of injury. As you can see, there's a significant nonlinear relationship between percentage of adult height and estimated likelihood of injury. At AFC Bournemouth, we utilized an approach of biobanding, where we took players within these percentages and then adapted training for these players. So we understood that players between 90 and 95% were at a greater risk, And if they're growing fast during the period of peak height velocity, we then subsequently change their training to provide them a decreased risk of injury. So we adapt our program in order to provide the right training load for individuals at the correct time, and subsequently aim to reduce the number of training and match days that those players miss during peak height velocity by using a biobanded approach, which groups players, whether they're 13, 14, 15 or 16. If you're in this zone, then you would have a red flag by your name, and we identify you as increased injury risk. So I've spoken quite fast, but we've got a little bit of an overview to finish, and then we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion. So we spoke about maturation in youth football. We then spoke about how this could be used in terms of our talent identification, the selection biases, the physical differences we see, and then again about coaches and scouts' perceptions. Then we spoke about talent development, including physical development, as well as the effects of biobanding, how biobanding can be utilized, and then on to injury. The next thing that I would leave you with is this understanding that growth and maturation feeds into every part of academy football and the development of these individuals. And at AFC Bournemouth, we're utilizing growth and maturation data and our information and understanding in all of these areas. So we've already spoken about the performance analysis and technical understanding of individuals. We already spoke about the physical development programs and understanding where those players are at. We're also linking this to psychology. There's some great work that looks at how the growth spurt can be linked to nutritional practices in academy football. And again, how does this affect the psychological and social side of academy footballers in their education? And then finally, so just to leave you with some ideas in terms of what to do next. The first stage would be to measure and report growth and maturation. The next stage would be to identify early and late maturing individuals and discuss how these effects might affect your performance and your potential of these players. And then finally, identifying pre, circa, and post-peak high velocity players to understand how you might manage the growth spurt in terms of injuries and training loads. I believe that is myself done. Thank you for listening. We've got plenty of time for any questions, and I'm sure Dan's going to share those questions in a second. And I've put my contact details down there at the bottom, so please reach out through Twitter or my email address if you have any further questions that don't get answered during this question and answer session in a second. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I think you can leave your presentation. You can keep on sharing your screen.
Okay, yeah.
I have one question. I think you answered it, but I will ask it anyway from James Duncan here. Is there any link between prematures and early on injuries that can threaten their career?
In terms of, does he mean in terms of injuries during the growth spurt threatening their career?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Prematures,
so,
yes.
Yeah. So essentially, that we know from the injury literature that previous injury is the biggest factor that could affect subsequent injuries. So if you're looking at predictors of future injury, having a previous injury is our biggest predictor. So that instantly there shows that there could be an effect, especially at the adult level. So reducing the number of injuries in the academy level is of real importance, especially for us at Bournemouth and obviously in the literature. I would also potentially say that particularly in women and girls, we see, in women and girls, we see the number of ACL and severe ligament injuries dramatically increase during adolescence, but also in football, the number of severe injuries are increasing from adolescence onwards. And therefore this, the time missed in terms of training and matches from a severe injury, which can last anywhere to a whole season to half a season, can have a significant effect on their development. And obviously, if they're early mature, as they then move into that phase earlier compared to their teammates and could be more at risk at an earlier stage.
Okay, David, a follow-up on that. From myself, what are your specific strategies to minimize risk of injuries, and how do you adapt the individual? You said earlier that you adapt the individual workload, and how do you do that more specifically?
So in one of my PhD studies, the way that we did it was we identified one training session a week that the coaches were more flexible in terms of changing the content of that session. We then reduced the number of accelerations and decelerations in terms of training load that they did. We then we allowed any players that weren't identified as at risk to just do a normal training session and continue as normal, because we wouldn't want to reduce everyone during that phase, but rather the key individuals that we think require it. The then intervention in that was specific technical training. So they did very light demands in terms of physical load, but they allowed them to develop their technical skills like the coaches would want. We also then did like movement competency training. So this included sort of balancing, jumping, landing, focused around that sort of adolescent awkwardness and developing the motor coordination again. And then they had an individualized strength program as well. So some of the literature around growth-related injuries shows that an increase in strength is beneficial for growth-related injuries and can subsequently allow you to get back to performance and back to training sooner. So strengthening those specific muscles through a strength program that we did as part of those sessions in the aim of getting those players back to normal. And then as part of that now, what we do is we monitor the soreness. So we get individuals to report their soreness scores the same way as you would report an RPE score. And then we then fluctuate our training loads in an aim to manage that soreness with it not increasing. And when the soreness starts to decrease, we can then increase the training load incrementally, like you would do in a normal return to play situation.
That has been beneficial because I think the number was that you reduced the number of injuries with 62%, right?
Yeah.
In the academy. Yeah.
So we used to have a really high incidence of injuries in the academy in that phase, like you saw on those graphs, and then we subsequently. So we used to have that curve there of an increase during the growth spurt, and then now it looks pretty much flat. So there's no increased risk during the growth spurt, which is a real benefit for us.
Wow. Okay, thank you. So next question. How authentic are the estimated results of the equation percentage of predicted adult height? From experience, we have seen individuals being taller or more muscular than their parents, which explains that there is a possibility of skipping generation. Is there an equation which has a higher authenticity than others? Which one is the best preferred?
So we use the Kammerer-Roche equation, and it does account to some extent of individuals being taller than their parents. Often with our predicted heights, we see that those predicted heights are taller than their parents. That's because it takes into account information in terms of the biological sort of genetic information from their parents in terms of their heights, but also takes in sort of the current height and the environmental factors of height for that age. So if you're taller for your age, that would give an indication that you're also going to potentially be taller than another individual at adulthood. Obviously, in combination, those two factors can allow us to predict the height. In terms of how good the method is, it has a high concordance with skeletal age measures, which is what we use as sort of the gold standard criterion method. Obviously, like all methods, there are potential limitations to it. So in my work in particular, and the majority of ways of representing this information, it's important to understand the confidence intervals around those predictions, as there's no it's unlikely that we'll ever get a prediction equation which will precisely identify an individual's height to the millimeter, for example. So that there is variation around that, and it's important to then track those things over time as well to understand where a player is at.
Thank you, David. Next question. How do you motivate players when using biobanding? A kid moved to a group of younger kids might be seen as a degradation.
Yeah, so that's a question that comes up a lot. So it's very easy for the early maturers to be motivated. So if an early maturer moves up, they're like, oh, I'm going to play with the big kids. I'm going to get all those advantage. On-time maturers, they're sort of getting a bit of a mixed bag. They'll get a few kids older and a few kids younger going up. With the late maturers, this always gets identified. I've not seen a situation where we've had a real issue at Bournemouth. The players understand the concept and they understand that each individual grows and develops at a different rate. And to some extent, they can see it as an advantage. We're talking to the players and we're explaining and educating to them that this is where you're physically at, and this group is the match for you physically. Go and show us that you're the best player. Go and show us your technical skills. I want you to be a leader. I want you to have more time on the ball and all these sort of things. We can, the ways that I would get around issues, if there were issues, and I've heard stories of other people discussing this, is giving that player a central role in the team. Potentially saying to a late mature that's moving down, I want you to be the best player. I want you to lead the other players. This is a new task for you where you've got to communicate, be a captain, instruct the players, educate them and help them. And there's been some really good evidence from Southampton of this idea of players moving between age groups and sort of shared learning, and older players potentially helping the younger players and communicating and teaching each other, which is obviously a technical and tactical thing, but also a social interaction between those players to help one another.
Thank you, David. So next question. What is the most common injury in the 12-year-old players in Sweden? It's very common with the knee problems. Some think that is depending on the artificial grass. Are you playing on artificial grass or natural grass?
Yeah, so sort of two parts of that question there. At 12, we're sort of seeing the players still having those severs and heel injuries, but that's when you start to see the start of those knee injuries, as that person said. So you've got Oscar Schlatters and Sinning Larsson Johansson, which both start to occur at roughly at those ages. In terms of the artificial grass versus natural grass, we do see differences in how that can affect the soreness from growth-related injuries. So often what we see is that the soreness is higher on artificial grass, generally because there might be more friction or impact when they're running, which then increases the load on those specific joints. And we often get higher ratings of soreness that way. We have utilized that to our advantage in some instances where we've got the option of training and playing on both, where we will make sure that players' more difficult sessions are on a grass pitch, because that will allow them to train for longer. And then when it comes to playing on a 3G pitch, that might be a session of a shorter duration to then avoid that increased soreness.
Thank you. Next question. Could you please expand on the psychological aspects and the effects biobanding has on them?
Yes, so that sort of comes back to part of it comes back to that idea of you're moving your earlies and lates up and down, and it's a definite challenge for the early matures psychologically to go and play against players of an older chronological age, because you've got that psychological challenge of playing against kids that they might perceive are better than themselves, and that sort of that test for them, and moving them out of their comfort zone where they might be the best player into a new scenario where they're not currently the best player. So that's one psychological challenge I can see that we often see moving up. The reverse, obviously, we spoke already about the sort of late maturers and taking on a new sort of social and psychological role within the squad, and that potential challenge of moving down where they might perceive it as a negative, and how do they then respond to that negative. We often don't try to frame that as a negative, so you might take away that sort of psychological effect. I had another thing that I was going to say on that. I can't remember. I'll potentially I'll think about it and I'll come back if there's something else I was going to point out.
That's all questions for now. Please write in this chat. We forgot if you have any more questions.
I have a question as well.
Yes,
okay.
Tommy, please.
Yeah, okay.
So I wonder, what do you foresee in the future in terms of biobanding and taking account for maturation? I mean, I'm a bit, there's been discussions about the relative age effect, for example, since the 1980s, and I'm not sure much has happened really. It's just, we still see the same effects. And so what do you anticipate now if we raise awareness of the different approaches used to account for maturity, such as biobanding, etc.? Do you think that we can? I mean, you show data on Southampton, etc., other academies. Is there a way really to sort of get away from this massive effect, or is it just small things we can do?
Well, so in terms of a research area, it's sort of continually growing, and there's new sports and new teams, and everyone's getting involved. In terms of the Southampton thing, a really interesting part of there, and it's sort of an anecdotal insight that I can give you from Megan, who's one of my colleagues at Bath that did her PhD at Southampton, is that they were seeing this selection bias towards, they're seeing a better match score given to those early maturers. They then continued that study for a longer period of time. And with education of the coaches, they then saw that bias removed, where the early maturers were no longer being biased just based on maturation, and the scores were then more, so they weren't biased. Essentially, there was no bias towards either end of the maturity scale. However, this didn't mean that they had suddenly got players in early, on time, and late in equal proportions, because there's more steps to it before in terms of the recruitment process. So they'd sort of come over one hurdle of the coach's opinions, but obviously, like we said, there's the scouts' opinions and recruiting players that's different, and it's often easier for the coaches to take an unbiased way when there's nothing riding on those games in terms of giving the players the scores. In terms of actual selection of the players, I don't know whether they're still selecting their early maturers. Like we've seen in the match minutes, all of our coaches are told that the games are not worth anything, and they don't have to win games, but that we still select the early maturers because my guess is that because they're the best performers on that day. But we should then, in an ideal world, have no sort of minute selection. In terms of where I see it going, my opinion is that groups, teams, governing bodies like yourselves will continue to do more work and will gradually get better and better. I still think that there will never be a situation where we just play based on biobands, because that won't work logistically from grassroots. Not every football club in the world can measure maturity at the same time. It's probably not plausible. However, and also some elite football clubs don't believe in it whatsoever. They think that we have the best players, and the best players right now will be the best players at adult level, which is a different approach to what other teams might take. So I think that it will continue to grow to an extent. I don't think we'll see a complete switch from chronological age to biobanding, but I know, for example, in Germany, there are clubs that are switching further than we are at Bournemouth towards, we're going to use more of a biobanding approach. And I think we're going to see a progression towards that in the sort of next years, but not so far that we go a complete switch.
Thank you. There's a few questions now in the chat. I just want to touch a little bit more before we take those. And my question is maybe more provocative then. Like, do we need to have national teams under 15? Do we need to have this very strong selective selection process actually? Do the benefits outweigh the harms? Is it needed to get, very good elite players, or can we just get rid of it?
So in my personal opinion, the best approach would be providing your national team resources to the players that you think have most long-term potential. And that way you could provide a high level of training to a wide variety of players across the board, whether that's early, on-time, late maturers, but technically gifted players, or whatever you think is going to provide you those elite players. I would then suggest that the emphasis moves away from winning under 15s international competitions and moves towards developing players to play towards the Swedish philosophy style and training those players for the idea that they will be the best at under 21s or first team level. However, we know that across football, there's a large internal motivation to win and be successful, and that does feed down into the youth levels.
Thank you.
Okay, another question. Could there be any advantages to divide the players into more than three groups?
Yes. So I sort of was a little bit, I don't know how to say it. I only showed the 3 age groups and the 3 groups because that shows the nicest picture. What we generally do, so for example, say if we go above under 15s to under 16s and under 18s, we will then move them into their appropriate bioband as well. So we might have a group that's 95 upwards, and then we also might have a group that goes and trains and plays at under 18s, where they're sort of like our 100% group. So we then continue to group them. We also take the under 12s, which were lower than I think appeared on the graph, and we'll move them into their appropriate bioband as well. And then in terms of, so you can use it across a broader range. My philosophy on biobanding would be that you use it across the range where maturity affects the physical sizes that we're seeing. You don't see many maturity differences at under 9s, for example. So you might focus more on relative age effect stuff at the younger ages. In terms of more bands, it would be perfectly possible to group players on 2% bands, 3% bands, 4% bands. The 5% band, as Dan and Tommy I've discussed with you before, is only there as a sort of a marker of reducing the variation from an age group. Obviously, if you reduce to a 2% band, you might only have 2 or 3 players within such a small range that you wouldn't then be able to play fixtures. So it's sort of the 5% works in a nice balance between getting enough players to play biobanded fixtures, but also shrinking that variation that we see in an age group. But if you, for example, say if you could go, I don't know, 2% bands and have 6 teams involved, and then you just put all the players that are very close together in a 2% band, and that would be perfectly reasonable and possible if they wanted to do that.
Okay, next question. How often do you rearrange the players in different teams or groups based on their growth? Once per season or more often? So
every week we will consider whether what training and match group a player should be in, and the maturity will have an effect on that. So for example, this afternoon I spoke to the under 16s age group coach about whether some 15 should move into the 16 squad, and we spoke specifically about the early maturers and should they play in the 16s fixture coming up on this Sunday, for example. So every week we consider that as a factor in terms of our training and games program. In terms of a completely biobanded fixture, we would work every 6 weeks. So we work in a 6-week cycle at Bournemouth, and we do 5 weeks of age group game. On the 6th, we would then bioband, and then we'd get in 5 weeks of age group game, 6 bioband. And normally the aim would be train for the whole week as a biobanded group. So you get to see them in a training situation, the players get to play together, get those new social interactions, and then play the fixture against another academy local to us in those biobands again. That's the way that we do it at Bournemouth. There's no real set way, and I can see advantages of both. I know that there's another academy in the south of England that will do it once a week. So they will go Tuesday night, we will bioband, and then they do Wednesday, Thursday normal, and then play their game on Sunday. And then every Tuesday, they will move the players into those groups. So you get the regular effects of biobanding. I don't think that there's obviously pros and cons to each. So it would depend how you want to use it in your club environment.
A follow-up from me then on that one. I mean, of course, I'm thinking also that you shouldn't the aim is not to win in these age groups, to win games or win leagues or tournaments, but I mean on the first team level, the relationships between players and the team spirit is very, very important. Do you think they lose that sense if they are moved up and down every week or every 6 weeks, that they get new players, new you know what
I understand what you mean. From our perspective, I don't think it negatively affects, because we move players so often. We're always looking for the right place for the players at a time, and from our some kids don't like it. If they get moved away from their friends, they'll be upset, but then that's sort of part of football, of playing with the team that you've got there on the day. They might not have their friends with them when they're playing first team football. They might not be able to play with. They might go and play in the first team at under 18 and not know any of the players, for example. So there's some sort of psychological and social effects there. I think that's partly why when we do a biobanding fixture, we train for the week, is that coaches quite like the idea of preparing the squad for the game. That goes a little bit back towards, it doesn't matter about winning and that sort of effect there, but the being able to perform as a team in a game can have beneficial developmental perspectives of being able to play together, understand those sort of technical and tactical sides, and playing with new players, and understanding the different styles of different players at different times can be a learning exercise in itself.
Okay. So next question, in biobanding, what age difference is the most likely to happen? Have you had experience of 13, 14 years old, early mature players playing with 17 or 18-year-old players? What could be the pros and cons?
Yeah, so not quite as extreme as the question suggested there. It happens regularly that you could have under 13s playing with under 16s. You could have 15s playing with 12s, 14s, etc. And the age groups sort of, they in the context of biobanding, they don't really matter. Obviously, the older age groups have an advantage of an increased training age, increased sort of technical, tactical awareness, and playing football for longer and those sort of things. In general, the variation we see in maturity is about 4 years, so I wouldn't expect any differences in age group to be above 4 years. So sort of like 12s to 18s would be very large. You'd have to be a very early maturing 12 and a very late maturing 18 potentially to get that. And the sort of the pros and cons, they sort of relate back to biobanding. There might be situations where moving an under 12 to play with some under 16s might not be the best thing for that under 12. My argument for that would be, if they're physically a 16-year-old, they need to learn how to play against people physically the same size as them, because it's unlikely they will always be the physically biggest. They might be the biggest on the football pitch as an adult, but they might not. The potential disadvantage, so the advantages are all the advantages we discussed today about biobanding. The disadvantage is potential psychological damage if it's really too hard for them. If they're really out of their depth and they get upset and there's no opportunity for success, they might be damaging. So that would be something to consider before moving them into that situation. And then the other potential one that I could see is a greater likelihood of injury. But again, biobanding has been shown to reduce injuries because you're reducing that variation. So you might have a 12 and 16 16-year-old, but if they're both 14 biologically, then they might be physically matched. So I potentially see more advantages than the possible disadvantages, as long as you don't take as long as the player can cope psychologically.
Okay, another question for myself then. I mean, if you have like a 14-year-old that they are really early, and he or she goes up to the 16, but the chronological age is 14, then the other players maybe have been playing football for 2 years longer. And of course, we're talking about physical or physiological age, but then they move up to under 18, and then they're supposed to go up to the under 21. But their chronological age is 15, 16. How do you deal with that, like selection? Do they get 2 more years to go up to or are they kicked out or selected away?
So the way that we deal with that is that in our biobanding situation, they will move up to play against the 16-year-olds, as you expressed. They will also obviously be playing their age group games for the other parts of those weeks. So you're getting both age group and biobanding, which would be my suggestion of always potentially having a mix. The next aspect from our point of view is that they then most likely would move to the 18s when it's the right time for them chronologically age-wise, because once you get to sort of 16s, they're all sort of past their growth spurt and they start becoming more narrow in terms of the variation, because they're all coming out of their growth spurt. So the biggest variation we see is during that sort of under 14s age, where you get some players that have gone through their growth spurt and some that haven't even started. So that they generally move into the 18s at the right time. Sometimes our early developers will be playing, 16-year-olds will play in the 18s, and sometimes our more advanced 18s will be playing in the 21s, as happens in most football situations. And maturity does have an effect on those things. If you're physically an 18-year-old at 16, you're likely to be able to cope with an under 18s football. The other thing that I was going to say on that one was also we sort of do the reverse with our late maturers. So if you'll finish your under 16s year and you should be moving to 18s, we often will keep players in the 16s if that's the right thing for their maturity, aiming to try and retain those players. So we've had a few late maturers in recent times that have got through to their under 18s, and we the same as we do at all levels, we give them appropriate fixtures and training times to suit where they are at in terms of their maturity. So you've got both the early and the late scenarios that you described.
Okay. If there's any more questions, please state them in the chat. No more questions. Tommy, do you have any more questions, comments?
No, I'm good. I think this was very interesting. I think this is certainly worth giving more attention to also in Sweden in the future.
Okay. Then I thank you a lot, David, for presenting this to us, and we look forward to collaborating with you in the future. Yeah. With both the research, but also maybe do some when this virus is slowing down. Then we can invite you here to Sweden, and we can do maybe some practical sessions about this.
Yeah, definitely.
And I will switch to Swedish now, David. You don't mind. Tack så mycket ni som deltog. Och som David sa, är det några frågor som kommer i efterhand så kontakta honom. Kontakta mig också om det är någonting annat. Jag kan också passa på att säga att de här webbinarierna kommer fortsätta. Vi kommer ha ett webbinarium den 5 maj som går mer mot taktisk matchanalys, som är mer mot elit. Vi kommer också ha skaderiskminimering med en forskare som heter Shane Malone från Irland. Och flera är i pipeline inom både fotbollsfysiologi, fotbollspsykologi, future team och matchanalys då. Den här presentationen, eller den här webbinariet kommer läggas ut på hemsidan som jag visade i inledningen. Ja, tack än en gång. Thank you David, one more time. Tack så mycket Tommy.
Tack själv.
Tack Johan Svensson för att du